The events of February 2014 became a point of no return in Ukraine's history. Russia, which had tried until the very end to keep Ukraine within its sphere of influence, shifted to open aggression. Then came the annexation of Crimea, the occupation of parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and the full scale invasion by the Russian army. All of this was done to break independent Ukraine and bring it back under the Kremlin's control. February 20th is one of the most tragic days of the Revolution of Dignity. 12 years ago, on this day, 48 protesters lost their lives in the center of the Ukrainian capital. In total, there are 107 people on the list of the Heavenly Hundred Heroes. As historians later wrote, it was in the winter of 2014 that the first battle took place in the war that continues to this day. Those tragic days became a symbol of the price Ukraine pays for its determination to be free. That is why both the events of the Revolution of Dignity and Russia's war against Ukraine are seen as a single process of resisting Russian aggression.
Ukrainians always defend what is theirs. They defend their independence, their dignity, and their right to live freely. It was the people themselves who chose and defended freedom for Ukraine. Ordinary people who care about what will happen to Ukraine and how Ukrainian children will live. We remember the price that was paid for this in 2014. We honor the courage of every participant in the Revolution of Dignity, of everyone who stayed on Maidan so that Ukraine would not be left without freedom. Eternal memory to the heroes of the Heavenly Hundred and to every Ukrainian man and woman who gave their lives so that Ukraine could be free. Glory to Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, on Telegram.
In the Kremlin, the Revolution of Dignity was called a coup d'etat with orchestrated and paid for protests. It was then that they eagerly started making up horror stories about Nazis in the center of Kyiv. In Moscow, they would not allow for a scenario in which Ukraine would ultimately choose a European path. But it was precisely to defend their right to free choice that Ukrainians came out to Maidan. The Kremlin was pushing its own alternative to European integration on Ukraine, the customs union. In reality, it was simply a tool to maintain control over Ukraine's economy and politics. Even in the early days of the protests, Western media wrote that for Putin, they were an unexpected blow because Ukraine was literally slipping out of its grasp.
Many Ukrainians see the agreement with Europe as a critically important step toward a brighter economic and political future, as well as a way to break free from Russia's grip and Ukraine's Soviet past. Today's protests against Yanukovych's decision to back out of agreements with the EU are cornering Russia. The protests and the outrage of Ukrainians over Russia's influence make it nearly impossible for Yanukovych to accept the Kremlin's proposed alternative, joining the customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. From a publication in the New York Times dated December 1st, 2013.
Lies and manipulation have accompanied the Kremlin's actions since the very first days of Maidan, and in the war against Ukraine, they have reached truly astronomical proportions, both in terms of cynicism and brazenness. In 2014, Putin insisted that there were no Russian troops in Crimea, and that the so-called Little Green Men were supposedly local self-defense forces. But just a couple of months later, in an interview with Russian propagandists, he boasted about personally overseeing the progress of his military operation. The dictator said the same thing about the Russian occupation of certain territories in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. A few days before the full-scale invasion began, Putin claimed that Russia had no intention of attacking Ukraine and that the troops near the border were just conducting exercises. And then, on February 24th, 2022, he said this phrase:
At the same time, occupying Ukrainian territories is not part of our plans. We are not going to impose anything on anyone by force.
Ukrainians who found themselves in territories occupied by Russia know all too well the price of this lie. Lawlessness, torture, and looting. That's how you can describe what the Russian occupiers are doing on Ukrainian soil. To strip people of their right to choose, to destroy their way of life, to replace the local population with a controlled and loyal one, that's the goal the Kremlin is pursuing. Mass killings of civilians, women, the elderly, and children, this is the reality the Russian occupiers have brought to Ukraine. If you dare to criticize the invaders, you get charged with extremism or anti-state activity. The Russian authorities have taken the practice of seizing homes to the federal level, and people who refuse to accept Russian passports have been denied even access to education and healthcare. Millions of ruined lives mean nothing in the twisted logic of the Russian dictator. Total control through fear, threats, and repression, that's what Putin has dreamed of and still dreams of imposing on Ukraine.
Russia's military aggression is unlikely to stop. Russia may strike Ukrainian cities and power grids to undermine the morale of Ukrainians and their economy, but air attacks alone are unlikely to lead to capitulation. Putin may believe that Europe will abandon Ukraine, but European support actually increased last year. His biggest hope may be that Ukraine, which itself is suffering from a serious shortage of manpower and equipment, will go through a political crisis or run out of soldiers and weapons before Russia does. However, Putin's bet on Ukraine's collapse over the past 4 years has been a losing one, and the chances of that happening are decreasing. From a publication by The Economist.
By launching a bloody war against Ukraine, Putin constantly demands that the world recognize his right to seize other people's territories and impose his own rules. Any peace negotiations are turned into a farce by the Russian side, and they show no willingness to make any compromises. Instead, Kremlin negotiators deliver pseudo historical lectures, including about the events on the Maidan, and make unfounded accusations and demands. At the same time, the Kremlin is increasingly rattling its nuclear saber and threatening Kiev's partners. The best proof that the Russian dictator has no intention of stopping the war is in the numbers. In 2026, the aggressor country allocated almost 13 trillion rubles for the army and weapons procurement, and another 4 trillion for various security agencies. Altogether, the security sector received about 38% of the entire budget. In the West, they openly state the Russian elite will not be able to do without war in the near future.
Reason and humanitarian arguments will not convince Putin. That's the bitter truth. That's why the goal of European efforts is to prevent the Russian state from continuing the war and from further economically funding it. A return to normal relations with Putin in the near future is practically impossible. Looking at this regime in this blind, furious terror, there's almost no hope. The Russian ruling elite won't be able to do without war in the near future. Right now, we are witnessing this country in a state of profound barbarism. This will not change in the foreseeable future, and we have to accept that. Friedrich Merz, Federal Chancellor of Germany, in an interview with Spiegel.
The revolution of dignity and Russia's war against Ukraine are not separate episodes, but a single process of Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression, first covert, then open and full scale. It was precisely the attempt to deprive Ukrainians of the right to make their own choices that became the starting point of this confrontation. Since 2014, the Kremlin has consistently tried to rewrite reality, impose its own version of history, and forcibly change borders. However, over the years of war, it has become clear the strategy of intimidation, destruction, and exhaustion has not broken Ukrainian society. Ukraine continues to fight not only for its land, but also for the right to determine its own future. And understanding this continuity from the revolution of dignity up to today is fundamentally important for assessing what is happening and for the decisions the world makes.